All right. Dr. Nestor Castro is a professor of anthropology at the University of the Philippines, Diliman. So dito lang din sa UP. Specializing in cultural anthropology, his expertise includes ethnicity and indigenous peoples issues, environmental and social impact assessments, and cultural heritage management. So his works have been published in notable journals such as Le Temps Moderne, New Asian Visions, Colloquium, The New Horizon of Contemporary Sociological Theory, Philippine Social Sciences Review, Kasarinlan, and Diliman Review. Dr. Castro has also done field research on several indigenous communities in the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Myanmar, New Caledonia, Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, Thailand, and Vietnam. His master's thesis was on the communist movement in the Cordillera region, while his PhD dissertation was on the politics of ethnic identity in Kalinga. Oh, diba? Very, very learned ang ating first guest speaker for today.
Dr. Castro also served as the chair of the Anthropology Department, Associate Dean of the College of Sciences, Social Sciences and Philosophy, or CSSP, and Vice Chancellor for Community Affairs of UP Diliman. He also served as the Vice Chairman of Ugnayang Pang-Agham Tao, or UGAT, Vice Chairman of the National Research Council of the Philippines, or NRCP, the Social Sciences Division of that council. Pati na rin yung Southeast Asian representative of the International Commission for the Rights of Aboriginal People, or ICRA, and the president of the International Federation of Social Science Organizations, or IFSSO. At present, Dr. Castro is the president of the International Council of Museums Philippines, or ICOM-PH, and vice president of the Pi Gamma Mu International Honor Society in the Social Sciences Philippine Alpha Chapter.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction, and also good afternoon to everyone watching and listening in this webinar. So since I have very limited time, I will focus on 10 myths. I think I have about 20 minutes, so 2 minutes each. So basically, this is lecturing about who indigenous peoples are by sharing to you who they are not. So ito yung mga common na misunderstanding natin about indigenous peoples. Yung unang-unang myth na ito laganap kahit na sa social sciences, that indigenous peoples are racially different from the rest of Filipinos. And our legacy within anthropology has been part of the culprit in propagating such a myth. Basically, I'm referring to H. Oatley Bayer's wave of migration theory. So according to Bayer, who we recognize as the father of the anthropology department of UP, he said there are 3 races that came into the Philippines. Ito yung wave of migration theory. Ang first wave were the Negritos. Ang second wave were the Indonesians. And the third wave are the Malays. Siguro napag-aralan ninyo yan sa inyong elementary and high school social studies. Pero alam natin sa ngayon na this is a myth. Sa isang banda, may katotohanan pa rin yung Negritos are racially different from the rest of us. Kasi pag sinasabi nating race, we're referring to an ethnic group that has some sort of biological basis. And based on phenotypic characteristics of Philippine Negritos, we know that they are unlike many of us because their skin color is relatively darker than the rest of Filipinos. Their hair texture is kinky to curly. They are relatively shorter. That's why tinawag sila ng mga Kastila na Negrito or small black communities. And Negritos are spread all over Southeast Asia. They are not just found in the Philippines. They're found in coastal New Guinea, in the Malay Peninsula, in southern Thailand, and in the Andaman Islands in the Indian Ocean. Pero pagdating na sa Indonesian at Malay races, we know that these are not 2 different races. Actually, Malaysians, Indonesians, Filipinos, Vietnamese, Southern Chinese, we all come from the Mongoloid stock that originated from mainland Asia. So bakit sinabi ni Bayer na ibang lahi yung mga taga-Cordillera dahil sila Indonesian stock, while ang mga Tagalog, mga Visayans, Malay stock? Kasi wala pang advances during his time about genetics. We know now that merong process na tinatawag na genetic drift na certain populations in the country nag-share sila ng kanilang gene pool, gene characteristics, and through time, that made them dissimilar from the rest. So yung mga taga-Cordillera, dahil sa kanilang adaptation sa mountainous environment, medyo nagbago ang kanilang itsura, pero we all come from the same race. Ngayon, bakit importanteng i-correct ito? Kasi pag ang tingin natin magkakaibang lahi tayo, so parang hindi tayo magkakapwa Pilipino. Parang sila dayuhan kesa sa atin, which we have to correct. Okay, let me go to the second one. Ito, sasabihin nyo, katawa-tawa naman ito, pero I still hear this, that IPs are barely human. Some have tails, such as the grocs and the mangyans, and some have gills, such as the bajau. So yung litrato sa kaliwa ay from a 1900s picture na sinasabing nakuna ng mga Amerikano sa Benguet area. Mga igorot daw, at meron daw buntot ang isang igorot. We don't know if that is a unique individual or it's an optical illusion, yung bahag niya ang nakikita. Pero obviously, igorots and mangyans don't have a tail. So na-propagate ang ganitong myth. I still meet some people na nagtatanong sa akin, totoo ba na ang mga mangyan merong buntot? Of course, wala. Yun namang mga badyaw na sinasabing merong hasang or gills, parang isda, kasi napakagaling nilang lumangoy sa dagat. Alam din natin, hindi sila isda, sila rin ay mga tao. Merong mga new studies na sinasabi na nagkaroon sila ng adaptive mechanism by having larger spleens. At dahil dito, kakayanin nilang magtagal sa ilalim ng dagat. Okay. So, obviously, tao sila, hindi sila hayop. Pangatlo, indigenous peoples are non-Christian pagans. Pag sinasabi nating pagan, sila yung mga walang paniniwala sa Diyos, maraming konsepto ng mga Diyos, tapos hindi sila mga Kristiyano. This is no longer true because many of our indigenous peoples are Christian, and of course some are Muslim. Halimbawa, yung mga taga-Sagada, many of them are Anglicans. Marami sa mga Teduray sa Maguindanao, ganun din, mga Christian sila. Maraming Christian missionary groups in Mindanao. So, hindi na relihiyon ang naghihiwalay sa atin sa isa't isa, kundi magkakapareho rin tayo. Ano? Pero pag sinabi ninyo, bakit sa larawang yan? Meron pang mga bulol or yung rice granary god. Para sa mga katutubo natin, hindi naman mapapaghiwalay yung kanilang culture sa kanilang belief system. So even if they are Christians, they still adhere to the native ways. And that doesn't make them pagans. Pang ilan na ba to? Pang-apat na yata. That indigenous peoples are war freak savages. Alam ko saan ang gagaling ang ganitong myth because meron tayong mga katutubong Pilipino that in the traditional past had a practice of head taking or head hunting. Ang makikita natin sa larawan or rated PG yan, so sa hanay ng mga bontok, yung larawan sa kaliwa, pugot yung ulo, Larawan sa kanan, yung ulo lang ng kaaway ang nakikita natin. So, pinupugutan nila ang kanilang mga kaaway. Pero ilinaw natin, hindi naman pinupugutan kahit sino, kundi kaaway lamang ang pinupugutan. Ikalawa, hindi naman ito laging nangyayari. Ikatlo, lalong-lalo na ngayon, na very, very rare na ang incidents ng head taking. At pangatlo, masyadong pinatampok natin yung warfare among indigenous peoples while neglecting that they also have peace pact systems. Sa Cordillera region, where I did my study, meron silang institution na tinatawag na Bodong, also called Vochong, also called Pudon, also called Puchon. Ito ay peace pact mechanism where two distinct tribes constantly renew peace among themselves. So bakit ba natin masyadong pinapatampok yung war instead of the peace mechanism? The next myth, IPs are superstitious and non-scientific. Kaya ko pinili ang larawang ito na sa pinatubo kasi yung kaliwa, yung pagsabog ng pinatubo, sa kanan, yung mga Aita na nagsilikas, pero yung iba sa kanila naapektuhan din ng pagsabog ng pinatubo. Kasi yung mga Aita, meron silang paniniwala na bago pumutok ang bulkan, meron na silang mga nakikitang omens. Nakikita na nila nagtatakbuhan ang mga bayawak, nagtatakbuhan ang mga ahas. So alam na nila na merong mangyayaring sakuna. So ito ay sasabihin ng iba, that's mere superstition. But actually, merong scientific basis nito because animals are more sensitive to certain vibrations on the ground. Of course, napaka-short nung time span between observing this phenomenon and the actual eruption. So, kaya't naapektuhan din ang mga katutubo natin. Pero, what I'm trying to say is, yung tinatawag nating mga pamahiin ng mga indigenous people natin, marami rito merong mga scientific basis. Pero syempre, sa hanay ng mga katutubo, ipapaliwanag nila yon sa paraang magical dahil yun ang kanilang worldview. The next slide is, indigenous peoples do not want to be Filipinos, and some of them have opted to secede from the Philippines. Itong larawang ito actually ay sa Sulu, sila ay mga tausug. Technically speaking, from the point of view of the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples, the tausug, who are part of the Bangsamoro people, are not considered as indigenous people. Well, that's debatable, but that's the legal application of the law. Pero mapapansin natin sa iba pang mga indigenous peoples in the Philippines, there was never a clamor to secede from the Philippines. Ang pinakamalapit sa MNLF, MILF, sa Cordillera region ay ang Cordillera People's Liberation Army that seceded or split from the NPA in that area. Pero even the CPLA does not call for secession. It calls for an autonomous region within the Philippine state. At kung babalikan pa natin ang ating history, even during the time of the Katipunan, merong mga Aita, may mga Igorot na miyembro rin ng Katipunan. So they have been part of the clamor for a unified Philippine nation. The next myth is that indigenous peoples are poor because they are lazy. May two parts ang myth na ito. One is that they are poor, pero generally, yes, this is true. Merong mga exceptions dyan. Meron tayong mga ilang educated indigenous people. Pero they are poor not because they are lazy. So madalas pinoportray sa mass media, picture sa left, badyaw, tangay-tangay ang kanyang sanggol, namamalimos, kumakatok sa mga kotse. Ganun din ang mga Aita, bumababa sa Maynila, namamasko. Let us understand that the Badyaws and the Aitas traditionally are hunting and gathering societies. So talaga silang palipat-lipat ng lugar para maghanap ng pagkain. Kaya lang sa kasalukuyan, wala ng pagkain sa kanilang ancestral domains dahil sa nung sumabog ang pinatubo o kaya dahil napataboy sila sa kanilang lupang ninuno. So ang quote-unquote panlilimos ay isang modernong translation ng gathering. This time, hindi na talagang food, kundi money in order to purchase food. So let us understand where they are coming from. But hindi naman to lagi, hindi to pang araw-araw. Patuloy pa rin silang nagtatanim ng kamote, patuloy pa rin silang naningisda. So masipag sila kung oobserbahan natin sa kanilang traditional na territories. The next myth is that ITs do not want to be educated. So para bang pabanjing-banjing sila, ito larawan din ng mga Aita na nagbibilyar lang, tapos actually hindi lahat sila Aita, no? Meron ding kasamang hindi Aita. Pero this is not the real story because we have many indigenous people who on their own are actively seeking education. Yung larawan sa kanan, ito yung pinakakilalang Lumat schools na self-initiative ng mga Lumat at saka mga indigenous people's advocates learning education through their own system. Halimbawa, instead of ABCs, kundi ano yung bagay na natatagpuan sa kanilang ancestral domain. Unfortunately, marami sa mga Lumad schools na ito, tulad ng nabanggit ng ating nagbigay ng welcome remarks, ay pinasara ng ating Department of Education. Alam ko may magtatalakay nito mamaya, kaya hindi ako magfo-focus dyan. The next one, I think this is the 9th, is that indigenous peoples refuse to change. They want to be traditional and they want to remain that way. They don't want to be bothered. So ito yung traditional na larawan. Actually, nag-exist pa rin naman ito. This is based on my field work among the Agta in Palanan, Isabela. Yung bahay ng mga Agta, yung tinatawag ng mga anthropologists na lean-to, because naka-lean lang yung habong, yung shed. Depende kung nasaan yung araw, nagro-rotate yung lean-to. Kung tag-araw, naandyan sila sa tabi ng dagat o ng ilog. Kung tag-ulan, aatras sila papunta doon sa mga kagubatan. Tapos every 3 weeks, at the average, palipat-lipat sila ng tahanan. Unfortunately, sa mass media, pati na rin sa educational system, ito ang stereotype image na pinapakita tungkol sa mga Agta. As a matter of fact, ang larawan naman sa kanan ay bahay din ng mga Agta at sa Isabela rin. Yung sa kaliwa ay sa Palanan, Isabela. Yung sa kanan ay sa Makunapon, Isabela. Parehong magkatabing bayan actually. Yung nasa kanan na larawan, bahay na bato, tapos yung taas ay kahoy, Agta rin ang may-ari. So sa mass media, including social media, ang madalas na pinoportray yung stereotype image as if hindi nagbago ang kultura ng mga indigenous people natin. Nagba-basketball din sila, nagse-cellphone din sila, nanonood din sila ng ABS-CBN. Oops, nung hindi pa pala pinapasara. So, katulad din natin sila. yung ganitong stereotype images ang kadahilanan kung bakit maraming Pilipino nagugulat kapag iba ang imahe na ating nakikita. Ewan ko kung mare-recall ninyo, dati naglumaganap sa social media si Carrot Man na taga Cordillera, napakagwapo raw, parang K-pop star. Tapos si Badjaw Girl, na palibot-libot, nagbebenta, napakaganda rin daw, parang artista. Bakit nagugulat ang mga Pilipino? Kasi ang stereotype image nila, pangit ang indigenous people, na hindi totoo. Ako, for several years, I've done participant observation among Ifugaos and among Kalingas. Napakaraming gwapo, napakaraming magaganda na artistahin. Pero hindi natin nakikita yun dahil laging ang pinapakita sila ay madudumi, gusgusin, hindi edukado. Siguro last point, at alam ko rin may magtatalakay dito, 10th myth is that indigenous peoples are being manipulated by terrorist groups such as the New People's Army. So ito ang isang larawan ng taga Caraga region. So most probably ito ay Manobo o maaari ring Mamanwa sa lugar na yon. Nakikita natin ang hammer and sickle na simbolo ng Communist Party, makikita natin ang armas. So definitely merong indigenous people natin na sumama talaga sa NPA. And they are advocating for change in the present system in the Philippines. Pero this is not the complete picture because marami rin tayong kapatid na indigenous people na nasa gobyerno. Sa both sides, sa katunayan, yung head ng Bureau of Prisons ay taga Cordillera rin na IT. Ano? So merong katutubo na Dilawan, may katutubo na NPA, may katutubo rin na DDS. Tulad ng ordinaryong Pilipino na maraming iba't ibang political and ideological persuasions. Ang malaking problema ko dito sa 10th myth is as if bobo ang ating indigenous people, madali silang i-manipulate, they cannot think for themselves. Yung nakikita nating NPA girl dito, most probably, she decided on her own free will to be a member of that group and not because she was manipulated into it. So again, extension to sa ating pananaw na hindi edukado, hindi sibilisado ang mga katutubo kung kaya't hindi nila kayang mag-isip para sa kanilang sarili lamang. Okay. So dito ko tatapusin dahil hindi ko alam kung may time pa ako. Kung may time pa ako, pwede pa naman akong magbahagi ng iba pa.